There are no stars tonight but those of memory. Yet how much room for memory there is in the loose girdle of soft rain. There is even room enough for the letters of my mother's mother, Elizabeth, that have been pressed so long into a corner of the roof that they're brown and soft and liable to melt as snow. Over the greatness of such space, steps must be gentle. It's all hung by an invisible white hair. It trembles as birch limbs webbing the air. And I ask myself, are your fingers long enough to play old key that are but echoes? Is the silence strong enough to carry back the music to its source and back to you again, as though to her? Yet I would lead my grandmother by the hand through much of what she would not understand, and so I stumble. And the rain continues on the roof with such a sound of gently pitying laughter. Just taking a comfortable seat. Feet flat on the ground, knees at a right angle, and your hands just resting comfortably on your lap. And then doing the work of aligning that conduit between the heart and the head, softening the shoulders, straightening the back just a little bit, lengthening the neck just by a millimeter. Letting the belly soften, and all the armor removed from around the heart. Whatever's happening next today or whatever just happened doesn't exist for this half an hour, just to give a heart rest of those concerns, a heart pause, Rilke calls it. And then softening the face around the jaw, the eyes, forehead, the back of the neck, and then lengthening the breath. 4 easy counts in with a little pause at the top. And then 5 counts out. feeling that connection between the workings of the heart and the mind excreting thoughts, like the mouth secretes saliva, it said. But the mind is not the thoughts it secretes. Let them just pass by. You can stand back and watch them and just say, how interesting. If you find your mind wandering, that's the point of the meditation, to just notice these things, to be the witness, to be the observer. Staying with that breath, 4 counts in, 5 counts out. My Grandmother's Love Letters by Hart Crane. There are no stars tonight but those of memory. Yet how much room for memory there is in the loose girdle of soft rain. There's even room enough for the letters of my mother's mother, Elizabeth, that have been pressed so long into a corner of the roof that they're brown and soft and liable to melt as snow. Over the greatness of such space, steps must be gentle. It's all hung by an invisible white hair. It trembles as birch limbs webbing the air, and I ask myself, are your fingers long enough to play old keys that are but echoes? Is the silence strong enough to carry back the music to its source and back to you again, as though to her? Yet I would lead my grandmother by the hand through much of what she would not understand. And so I stumble. And the rain continues on the roof with such a sound of gently pitying laughter. I wanted to end on this poem because it was really the beginning of my spiritual life when I first heard this poem. I was 19 years old and I was in my first poetry workshop. I was like a lot of young writers who enjoyed writing more than even reading. In fact, I wasn't sure I understood everything that I was reading at the time. The poets that I love now best, like Keats and Emily Dickinson, hadn't yet started to speak to me. And there really wasn't a poet that I would say, oh, this was the poem, or this is the poet who speaks to me. And then my teacher, Bruce Weigel, recited this poem on the first day of class in my first poetry workshop. And I was hooked for life. I was 19 years old, and Bruce told us that Hart Crane was 19 years old when he wrote this poem. Hard to believe, given the sophistication of the rhetoric and the language here, and also the gift of its free verse at a time when that too was really rare, because it was 1919 when he wrote the poem. So I heard this poem and I felt like Hart Crane was doing exactly what he was describing, taking the music to its source and back to you again, as though to her. He was taking the music to its source and expressing himself in such a sincere, honest, genuine, gentle way that it felt like it was my own voice coming at me and speaking to me, even though it was somebody already dead for 55 years who was writing this poem. That was a profound experience for me. And so I memorized it myself. And in fact, I just recited it to my own students on Tuesday night, on the last night of our graduate class. So it's about the power of writing, but it's also conceding about how far writing can take us and about the humbleness and the gentleness and the strength required in order to cross any divide between people, whether you're writing to them, about them, or just trying to make contact. So Hart Crane was born in 1899 in Garrettsville, Ohio, and he only published one book in his lifetime. He published White Buildings in the 1920s, and this is the collection that the poem appears in. He also wrote a great book that was published posthumously called The Bridge, which is about his living near the Brooklyn Bridge and overlooking the New York skyline in the late 1920s. Incredibly exciting time when all of these new skyscrapers were coming up. He writes all about it, and he was a member of the avant-garde in the 20s. The rest of his poetry doesn't really look like this. It's very dense and complex. It's sort of like Hopkins in an industrialized world. But this poem is a special one. And sadly, he died. He leapt from a ship called the Orizaba into the Gulf of Mexico in 1932, and he drowned. But given the sad aspect of the end of his story, I want to emphasize wholeheartedly what an exuberant poet Hart Crane is. So, if anything, the writing of poetry and his engagement with literature was what kept him alive as long as it did. He was, on the page at least, and in his letters, a very joyful person and a very hopeful person. He was a poet of Ananda, the Sanskrit word for bliss. So, what is happening here in this poem? In the poem, if you notice, if you look at it, the whole world seems to be this body of the ancestor, of the grandmother, in which he lives inside, alive. He calls it the loose girdle of soft rain. And the letters are like these little corpses. They're brown and soft and liable to melt as snow. So the whole world is this body that he's living inside. And in order to cross the greatness of such space, he has to take gentle steps. So gentleness is a notion to extract from this poem, the gentleness of those steps across great space when trying to reach the other. But I think ultimately this is a poem about strength. But it's not the strength that comes of our doing, of holding things up or fixing things or handling things. This is the strength of silence, the silence that carries the music back to its source. And it's the silence, the source of which is where he and his grandmother and the unknown are all one thing. They all connect there. Like in Mary Oliver's poem earlier this semester, where you go down to the roots of the flower, and at the roots, where it meets the water, it becomes the whole world. So it acknowledges the strength of the silence that's like a conduit connecting the unknown with the present. There's a lot of Buddhism in this poem, whether Crane intended it or not, because it's a poem in that strength aspect. It's a poem about interbeing. When I look at the world, I'm looking at my grandmother, the loose girdle of soft rain. When I look at myself, I'm looking at the whole world. And then last, I want to say it's also a poem about how difficult it is to say clearly how things are. It's a confusing world. There are no stars tonight, but those of memory. Yet how much room for memory there is in the loose girdle of soft rain. So there's no stars to lead us by most of the time in life. We feel confused. And even my own grandmother wouldn't understand what I'm writing about her. Yet I would lead my grandmother by the hand through much of what she would not understand. And so I stumble. So it's acknowledging in a really smart and grown up way for a guy who's 19 years old that he's going to stumble. He's not trying to put on a disguise as the wise poet. He's the stumbling poet. He's the confused poet. He's the humble poet. And it's probably what spoke to me where I was at 19, because I felt exactly the same way. It was like the world was gently laughing at my efforts. But he's also the poet who's going to try anyway. And he gave me the compassion and the strength to do it myself. So, written at a time when Langston Hughes was writing The Negro Speaks of Rivers, the same moment, the same year, industrialized early 20th century, when this lost generation post World War I is trying to figure out how to write about the world when there's nothing consistent now with the past. We can't write about myths. We can't write about old ideas because they led us to World War I. What do we have now? It's a moment of reinvention, and it's using everything we've got in order to come back home to silence, come back home to constancy amidst all this impermanence. So let's read it one more time, and then I have some questions for you about getting into that strong silence. My grandmother's love letters. There are no stars tonight, but those of memory. Yet how much room for memory there is in the loose girdle of soft rain. There's even room enough for the letters of my mother's mother, Elizabeth, that have been pressed so long into a corner of the roof that they're brown and soft and liable to melt as snow. Over the greatness of such space, steps must be gentle. It's all hung by an invisible white hair. It trembles as birch limbs webbing the air, and I ask myself, are your fingers long enough to play old keys that are but echoes? Is the silence strong enough to carry back the music to its source and back to you again, as though to her? Yet, I would lead my grandmother by the hand through much of what she would not understand. And so I stumble, and the rain continues on the roof with such a sound of gently pitying laughter. So taking that comfortable seat, feet flat, your hands upturned on your lap, softening the shoulders, but lengthening the neck. How can we connect to that strong silence that bears us up? That silence at the source of everything. So I want you to think of a small divide that feels very hard to cross. Maybe you and a child, you and a partner, You in a distant place that you long for, or a political divide, or a divide within your community, or with a person that hurt you at work. And to just plant a seed of goodness, as Thich Nhat Hanh calls it, between you. And then there are 4 things that I'm taking from the poem to apply to that process. That we aspire to work despite its outcome. Are my fingers long enough to do this work? That we aspire to do the work despite its outcome. That will water the seed of goodness. The second, my favorite, is that we take gentle steps. We don't go rushing. We don't go forcing. We don't go fixing. What's the smallest next right thing to do? This poem is so filled with vulnerability. It's all hung by an invisible white hair. It trembles as birch limbs webbing the air. Take gentle steps. Keeping with that breath. 4 counts in and a little pause, and then releasing, relaxing. 5 counts out. The third is that we may be humble. There are no stars most of the time to read the situation by. He acknowledges he doesn't know what he's doing. He's stumbling. Last night in class, I remembered something from my undergraduate years, which is that all the answers to tests that I still remember are the ones that I got wrong. It's in getting it wrong that we find out what's right. It fixes it in our memories. That we be humble. We're going to get things wrong. We're going to stumble. And that's how we learn the right way. And then to just acknowledge that there are things we may never know about that other, that we may never understand, though I lead my grandmother by the hand through much of what she would not understand. There's a huge acknowledgement here of what can never be known. Planting the seed of goodness that we aspire to work despite its outcome, that we take gentle steps, that we be humble, and that we acknowledge there are things we'll never know. Just 2 more breaths. My Grandmother's Love Letters by Hart Crane. There are no stars tonight but those of memory. Yet how much room for memory there is in the loose girdle of soft rain. There's even room enough for the letters of my mother's mother, Elizabeth, that have been pressed so long into a corner of the roof that they're brown and soft and liable to melt as snow. Over the greatness of such space, steps must be gentle. It's all hung by an invisible white hair. It trembles as birch limbs webbing the air, and I ask myself, are your fingers long enough to play old keys that are but echoes? Is the silence strong enough to carry back the music to its source and back to you again, as though to her? Yet I would lead my grandmother by the hand through much of what she would not understand, and so I stumble. And the rain continues on the roof with such a sound of gently pitying laughter. Thank you, everyone.